They say the loudest sound in the world is not the explosion, but the silence that follows it. On a freezing Sunday afternoon in February 1965, inside Harlem's Audubon Ballroom, that silence was deafening. It was the moment after a sawed-off shotgun blasted through the chest of a man who had already accepted his fate. The smoke from the gun barrels drifted into the air, mingling with the screams of a pregnant wife and the tears of a shattered community. But this was not just an assassination. It was the violent seal on a prophecy. Years before the cities of America burned in the protests of the 21st century, before the cameras caught the brutality that the world now sees daily, this man stood alone and warned us. He told America that if it did not offer the ballot, it would inevitably face the bullet. He saw the racial reckoning coming with the precision of a weatherman predicting a hurricane. He was labeled a villain, a hate-monger, and a radical. But as we look at the divided state of our nation today, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable question. Was Malcolm X a threat to society, or was he the only one brave enough to tell us the truth about American civil rights and the future of racial injustice? To understand the man who would shake the foundations of America, we must first look at the boy who was hunted before he could even walk. The story of Malcolm X does not begin with a speech. It begins with fire. When his mother was pregnant with him in Omaha, Nebraska, the Ku Klux Klan rode up to their home, shattering the windows and demanding that his father, Earl Little, come out. Earl was a Baptist lay preacher who preached the teachings of Marcus Garvey, black pride, and self-reliance. In the eyes of 1920s America, this was a capital offense. The family was forced to move, but the shadow of racial injustice followed them like a curse. By the time Malcolm was 6, the violence that had stalked his family finally struck its fatal blow. His father's body was found nearly severed in two across streetcar tracks. The authorities called it a suicide, but the Little family knew the truth. It was a message. To add insult to injury, the insurance company refused to pay the death benefit, claiming suicide, leaving his mother, Louise, destitute with 8 children during the depths of the Great Depression. This was Malcolm's first lesson in systemic racism. The law did not exist to protect people who looked like him. It existed to crush them. Watching his mother slowly crumble under the weight of poverty and state interference was perhaps more painful than the death of his father. State welfare workers picked apart the family, planting seeds of doubt and division, until Louise was declared insane and committed to a mental institution. The children were scattered into foster homes. The boy who would one day debate scholars at Oxford was told by his 8th grade teacher, a white man he actually liked, that being a lawyer was no realistic goal for a nigger. That sentence was the final lock on the cage. He realized that talent and intelligence meant nothing in a society designed to keep him on his knees. So he stood up, turned his back on the school, and walked into the only world that welcomed him, the streets. He traveled to Boston and then to New York City's Harlem, transforming himself into Detroit Red. If you saw him then, in the neon glow of the 1940s, you wouldn't have recognized the austere leader in the suit and tie. Detroit Red was a creature of the night. He wore zoot suits with sharp shoulders and bright colors. He combed his hair, enduring the searing pain of lye straightener to make his hair look like a white man's. Later, he would look back on this with shame, calling it his greatest degradation, physically burning his own flesh to look like the oppressor. But let's not judge Detroit Red too harshly. He was doing what he had to do to survive in a jungle where the only options for a young black man were manual labor or the hustle. He chose the hustle. He sold drugs, ran numbers, guided wealthy white tourists to illicit thrills, and carried a gun. He lived fast, fueled by adrenaline and a deep, unconscious self-hatred. He was navigating the underbelly of the American civil rights struggle, a soldier in a war he didn't yet understand. He was numb, reckless, and heading toward an early grave. The inevitable crash came in 1946. Arrested for burglary in Boston, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was just 20 years old, but it was inside the cold concrete walls of Charlestown State Prison that the miracle happened. At first, he was so angry and rebellious that the other inmates called him Satan. He paced his cell like a caged panther, cursing God and the world. But then, he met a man named Bimby, an inmate who commanded respect not with his fists, but with his words. Bimby sparked a hunger in Malcolm that had been dormant since that 8th grade classroom. Malcolm began to read, but read is too weak a word for what he did. He copied the entire dictionary, page by page, word by word. He learned etymology. He learned history. He learned logic. As he devoured books in the prison library after lights out, using only the glow from the corridor, the bars of his cell seemed to dissolve. He read about the history of slavery, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the philosophy of Kant and Spinoza. For the first time, he saw his own life not as a series of bad luck, but as a product of a historical machine designed to produce broken men like Detroit Red. It was during this intellectual awakening that his family introduced him to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. They told him a story that shattered his reality, that the white man was the devil, and that the black man was the original human, divinely chosen but lost in the wilderness of North America. To a modern ear, this might sound extreme, but to a young man who had seen his father killed, his mother committed, and his people humiliated, this theology hit him with the force of revelation. It offered an explanation for his suffering and, more importantly, a path to dignity. He stopped eating pork. He stopped smoking. He poured the last of the lie down the drain and let his natural hair grow back. He dropped the surname Little, the name of the slave master who had owned his ancestors, and replaced it with the letter X. The X represented the unknown African name that had been stolen from him, a mathematical symbol for the variable that had yet to be solved. When he walked out of prison in 1952, Detroit Red was dead. In his place stood Malcolm X, a man possessing the intellect of a scholar, the discipline of a monk, and the burning rage of a prosecutor ready to put America on trial. He didn't just want integration. He wanted the truth. He didn't want to sit at a lunch counter next to a white man. He wanted to know why he had to ask for permission to eat in the first place. The transformation was complete. The nightmare of his childhood had forged a weapon, and he was about to aim it at the heart of the American conscience. When Malcolm X stepped onto a podium, the air changed. He didn't just speak, he indicted. In the 1950s and early 60s, while the mainstream American civil rights movement was singing "We Shall Overcome" and marching peacefully against fire hoses, Malcolm X stood tall, pointed a long finger at the camera, and declared that there was nothing to sing about. He was the national representative of the Nation of Islam, the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem. But to the masses, he was something far more dangerous. He was a black man who was not afraid. He possessed a charisma that was electric. Tall, with reddish hair and horn-rimmed glasses that became iconic. He looked like a professor, but struck like a heavyweight boxer. He didn't use the flowery, church-based cadence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His voice was a staccato rhythm of logic, sarcasm, and undeniable truth. He famously said, "I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare." For millions of African Americans living in the ghettos of the North, who were technically free but economically enslaved by systemic racism, Malcolm X was the first public figure to validate their rage. He told them their anger wasn't a sin. It was a sign of sanity. His rise was meteoric. He took the Nation of Islam from a small sect of 400 members to a powerhouse of 40,000. But his true power lay in his ability to deconstruct the white American psyche. He debated Ivy League professors and media pundits, often leaving them stuttering. When accused of teaching hate, he would calmly reply, "I'm not teaching hate. I'm teaching the truth. And if the truth sounds like hate to you, that's not my fault." He held up a mirror to America, and America was terrified of the reflection. The peak of his prophetic vision came in April 1964, at church in Cleveland, Ohio, where he delivered the speech that defines his legacy, "The ballot or the bullet." This wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a geopolitical forecast that rings hauntingly true today. In this speech, Malcolm X diagnosed the sickness of American democracy. He argued that the black vote was the decisive factor in American politics, yet the black community received nothing in return but broken promises. He warned, "It's got to be the ballot or the bullet. The ballot or the bullet." If you're afraid to use an expression like that, you should get back in the cotton patch. He wasn't calling for random violence. He was explaining a historical inevitability. He predicted that if the government continued to fail in its duty to protect black lives and ensure justice via the ballot, the people would naturally, inevitably turn to the bullet. He viewed self-defense not as a crime, but as a human right protected by the Second Amendment. He famously stated, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense, I call it intelligence." This perspective shifted the ground beneath the American civil rights struggle. While Dr. King appealed to the white man's conscience, Malcolm X appealed to the black man's spine. He rejected the term Negro, a label given by slave masters, and popularized Black and Afro-American. He made Black beautiful before it was a hashtag. He taught a generation to stop begging for a seat at a table where they weren't wanted and to start building their own table. This psychological liberation was his greatest victory. He was the surgeon cutting out the cancer of inferiority complex, even if the surgery was painful. The media tried to pit Malcolm X against Martin Luther King Jr., casting them as enemies, the sinner and the saint. But in retrospect, they were the yin and yang of the revolution. Dr. King was the shield, absorbing the blows to show the world the brutality of racism. Malcolm X was the sword, warning the world that the shield would not hold forever. Without the terrifying alternative of Malcolm X, the establishment might never have negotiated with Dr. King. Malcolm knew this. He once told Coretta Scott King, while her husband was in jail, "I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking I could make it easier." If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King. By 1964, Malcolm X was no longer just a local agitator. He was a global figure. He mentored a young boxer named Cassius Clay, guiding him to become Muhammad Ali, a transformation that shook the world of sports and culture. He was the most televised black man in America. Yet, despite the crowds chanting his name and the flashbulbs blinding him at every turn, he was walking a lonely path. He had begun to outgrow the rigid, separatist dogmas of the Nation of Islam. He started to see that the struggle against racial injustice was part of a worldwide human rights movement. He was at the height of his powers, a titan of rhetoric who could command a room with a whisper. But high peaks attract the fiercest storms. As his influence grew, so did the jealousy within his own organization and the anxiety within the FBI. The very voice that awakened a sleeping giant was about to be silenced by the forces he dared to challenge. The tragedy was not that he didn't see it coming. He predicted his own end just as clearly as he predicted America's future. He knew that in a land built on violence, a man of peace who demands justice is often the first to fall. They say you never hear the bullet that kills you, but Malcolm X heard the footsteps long before the trigger was pulled. By 1963, the ground beneath his feet began to crumble. The betrayal did not come from the white oppressors he had spent a decade fighting. It came from the very house he helped build. For years, Malcolm had revered Elijah Muhammad not just as a leader, but as a divine messenger. He was the father Malcolm had lost, the savior who had pulled him from the filth of prison. But rumors began to swirl. Whispers that the messenger was fathering children with his young secretaries while preaching strict morality to his followers. Malcolm, a man of absolute integrity, refused to believe it until he spoke to the women himself. The truth broke his heart. He realized that the movement he had dedicated his life to was rotting from the head down. The American nightmare wasn't just outside in the streets. It was inside the temple. The final straw came after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963. When asked for a comment, Malcolm described it as the chickens coming home to roost, meaning that the violence America exported to the world and inflicted on its black citizens had finally circled back to its leader. It was a harsh, insensitive truth, spoken at a time of national mourning. The Nation of Islam used this as a pretext to silence him. They suspended him for 90 days. But Malcolm knew this was not a suspension. It was an excommunication. He was being pushed out by jealous rivals who wanted his fame but feared his power. Stripped of his platform, isolated from his community, and watched by the FBI, Malcolm stood alone. But in this valley of shadows, he found a new light. In April 1964, he boarded a plane for the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca. What he saw in the desert transformed him forever. He saw people of all colors, from the darkest Africans to the bluest-eyed Europeans, circumambulating the Kaaba in unity. They ate from the same plate, slept on the same rugs, and prayed to the same God. For the first time, he realized that racial injustice was not an inherent biological trait of white people, but a mental sickness bred by Western culture and the American political system. He wrote a letter from Mecca that stunned his followers back home. I have eaten from the same plate and drunk from the same glass with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. He signed it not as the angry Malcolm X, but as El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He returned to America not less radical, but more focused. He no longer wanted to just separate black people from white people. He wanted to indict the United States government before the United Nations for violating human rights. He had evolved from a civil rights leader into a global human rights revolutionary. But America does not forgive evolution, and the Nation of Islam did not forgive desertion. The atmosphere in 1965 was thick with the scent of death. The threats moved from whispers to shouting. Malcolm is a dead man, they said openly. He was evicted from his home. He was followed everywhere he went. He told a reporter, I live like a man who is already dead. This wasn't paranoia. It was a calculation. He knew too much. He spoke too loudly, and he had made enemies of both the state and his former brothers. The violence finally breached his sanctuary on the frigid night of February 14th, 1965, just 1 week before the end. Malcolm, his pregnant wife Betty, and their 4 daughters were asleep in their home in East Elmhurst when a Molotov cocktail shattered the front window. Fire roared through the living room. Malcolm snatched his children from their beds, rushing them out into the freezing winter night in their pajamas, the flames licking at their heels. Standing on the lawn, watching his house burn while fire trucks screamed in the distance, Malcolm looked at his terrified family. The perpetrators hadn't just tried to kill him. They had tried to incinerate his babies. The next day, he stood amidst the charred ruins of his home, holding a press conference. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He looked tired. His eyes, usually sharp and piercing, held a profound sadness. He pointed to the ashes and said, "This is what they do." He blamed the Nation of Islam, knowing that saying so was signing his own death warrant. He knew the police wouldn't protect him. In fact, the police were conspicuously absent that night. In that final week, Malcolm X was a man walking through a ghost world. He was rejected by the establishment, hunted by his former allies, and misunderstood by the public. He tried to visit warmth and safety, but doors were closing. Yet, he refused to go into hiding. He scheduled a speech for the following Sunday at the Audubon Ballroom. He told his team, "We are going ahead." He was predicting the future of American civil rights, a future where the fight would be dangerous, messy, and fatal. He was showing us that the price of freedom is often paid in blood. He walked toward that ballroom not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as a man who had accepted that his death would spark more action than his life ever could. He was ready to pay the ultimate price for the truth he had found. Why was the most powerful government on earth so terrified of one man armed only with a microphone? The answer lies in a classified file on J. Edgar Hoover's desk. The FBI didn't track Malcolm X because they thought he was a criminal. They tracked him because they knew he was right. They feared the rise of a black messiah who could unite the masses, not just in America, but across the globe. While mainstream leaders were asking for American civil rights, which is a domestic issue, Malcolm X was demanding human rights. This distinction was lethal to the establishment. If it's a civil rights issue, it's America's internal family business. But if it's a human rights issue, it belongs in the United Nations. Malcolm was preparing to drag the United States before the World Court, to put Uncle Sam on trial for the crimes of slavery and segregation in front of African and Asian leaders. He was internationalizing the struggle, turning a local protest into a geopolitical crisis. That was a line the system could not allow him to cross. Today, as we look at the streets of America, the ghost of Malcolm X stands on every corner. When we watch the video of George Floyd gasping for air under the knee of an officer, we weren't just seeing police brutality. We were seeing the manifestation of the racial injustice Malcolm defined 50 years ago. He taught us that police brutality is not an accident. It is the enforcement arm of a system designed to control. He warned that you cannot have a functioning democracy when a segment of the population lives in a police state. His prophecy of the ballot or the bullet was never a threat. It was a diagnosis. Look at the cycles of American history. Every time the ballot fails, every time voting rights are suppressed, every time a peaceful protest is ignored, every time justice is denied in a courtroom, the bullet follows. We saw in the smoke rising over Minneapolis, over Ferguson, over Baltimore. The riots are not senseless violence. They are the language of the unheard, exactly as he predicted. The powder keg he spoke of in 1964 is still sitting in the living room of American society, and we are still playing with matches. To the world outside the U.S., Malcolm X remains a hero of liberation. In Africa and the Middle East, streets are named after him. They saw him as the man who refused to apologize for his blackness. But in America, his legacy is still a battleground. Textbooks often sanitize him or villainize him, afraid to touch the scorching heat of his words. They prefer the safe Malcolm, the one who died, rather than the dangerous Malcolm, the one who thought. But you cannot kill an idea. Systemic racism is still the rot in the floorboards of the House, and Malcolm X is the inspector who told us we need to tear the whole floor up, not just paint over it. He understood that integration without power is just another form of submission. He didn't want black people to just be employees in white corporations. He wanted them to own the factories. He didn't want them to just vote for politicians. He wanted them to be the politicians who wrote the laws. As we stand in the 21st century, the question is no longer, was he right? The evidence is on every news channel. The question is, are we finally brave enough to listen? The prophecy has come true. The future he predicted is our present reality. The check that America wrote to its black citizens has come back marked insufficient funds, and the debt collectors are now in the streets. On February 27, 1965, Harlem stood still. 20,000 people lined the streets to say goodbye. They didn't come just to mourn a victim. They came to honor a king who never wore a crown. Inside the Faith Temple Church of God, the actor Ossie Davis delivered a eulogy that still echoes through history. He didn't call Malcolm X a radical or a criminal. He looked out at the tear-stained faces and said, Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood. This was his meaning to his people. And in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves. They buried him in Ferncliff Cemetery, but they could not bury the fire he started. Malcolm X left no material fortune. He died with less than a few $100s to his name. But he left a psychological inheritance worth billions. He gave the American civil rights movement its spine. He taught a generation that dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you take. He showed us that the ballot or the bullet was never a threat of violence. It was a demand for responsibility. Today, racial injustice still casts a long shadow over the American landscape. The names of the victims change, but the story remains the same. Yet, because of Malcolm, the response is different. When we see young people of all races marching in the streets, demanding accountability, refusing to accept the status quo, we are seeing the children of Malcolm's ideology. He is no longer just a man. He is the conscience of the revolution. Some stories end without closure. But dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs to stand tall. Malcolm X predicted the storms we are facing today, not to scare us, but to prepare us. He showed us that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a gun, but a mind that has been set free. The assassin's bullet could stop his heart, but it could not stop his truth. As long as there is injustice in America, Malcolm X will never truly be dead. He is watching, waiting, and asking us the final question. Will we finally choose the ballot of true justice, or will we force the next generation to face the bullet? What do you think? Was Malcolm X a prophet who saw the future of America, or was he a radical ahead of his time? If this story reminds you of the fight for dignity in your own life, or if you believe his message is still needed today, share your thoughts below. We read every comment, and to anyone who has ever stood alone for what is right, we see you.